In part 1 of our series this week, we began to explore the minor parts of speech and their importance in providing structure to the major parts of speech. The ideas of phrases, or groups of words that belong together grammatically, using the prepositional phrase as our first example. 2 of the 3 relationships that nouns can have in a sentence, including that of the subject of a verb and the object of a preposition to form the prepositional phrase. In this video, we will explore the 3rd type of noun relationship, that of being the object of a verb. We will also continue our discussion of verbs to introduce the idea of clauses and review and expand our notion of grammatical necessity. Finally, we will revisit and expand our study of adverbs. So in part 1, we discovered that nouns need to be defined from now on by the relationships they have with other words in the sentence. So 2 of the 3 relationships we studied are serving as the subject of a verb, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this video, serving as the object of a preposition to form what we called a prepositional phrase. We also learned kind of the basic idea that every verb that we see must have a subject, and vice versa. So look at our example again. We've identified that the brown fox is at the beginning of the verb jumped. But how do we know that this is the subject of this verb? Well, again, one thing we talked about is that location is important. The noun that is in front of the verb is most likely going to be the subject. And then, of course, another idea we're going to look at is the form. So notice the form. The noun is in the singular form. And this is the singular form of the past tense verb, jumped. So again, this relates to an idea of agreement. If you'll notice, in our rules and limitations on the noun profile, we're going to redefine it by saying that subjects must agree with verbs in singular and plural form. Of course, with verbs, we've already discussed the fact that sentences must contain at least a subject and a verb. But now we're going to expand on that notion again to say they must have a subject and verb, and they must agree in form. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of subject-verb agreement. So when we talk about this idea of agreement, we're really talking about making sure that both are in the same form, especially when it comes to that singular or plural state. So when the noun is in the singular form, we must make sure the verb is in singular form as well. When the noun is in plural form, then the verb also needs to be in the plural form. Now, of course, English is a little tricky here, but actually, if you think about it, it's not that difficult, simply because there aren't that many variations that exist in English. So, for example, when we talk about action verbs and some linking verbs, notice, for example, that really the form we are concerned with the most involves the singular third person and the plural third person. So again, let's take our example, fox, or in the third person plural form, the foxes. And again, you would either need to add an S or an ES. We usually add ES when a particular word sometimes ends in a consonant. Not always, of course, but sometimes. So in this case, since we have the k sound with fox, this is what's called a voiceless consonant. We would add ES to the idea. But again, that's not always necessary. A lot depends on which particular consonant it's going to be. Now notice, though, that we are focusing on the present tense for a moment, because the present tense is generally where we have to worry about agreement. So, for example, if we're using a singular form, a lot's going to depend on if we're going to use an S or ES. And again, is it going to be an action verb or even some linking verbs? So in this case, walk would become walks, feel would become feels. In the plural third person form, notice even here, there's no change. So again, English is actually a fairly easy language when it comes to changing the verb form, mainly because there aren't that many variations. So again, notice how the singular form of the noun connects to the singular form of the verb in the present. So we would say the fox walks, or the fox feels, which of course would be almost the opposite in the present tense when it comes to the plural noun form. The foxes walk, the foxes feel. Now notice what happens when we talk about the verb to be, another kind of irregular or strange type of verb. Again, with the singular form, the present would be the fox is. In the past, it would be the fox was. For the third person, it would be the foxes are, the foxes were. And part of the idea is because the verb to be is a verb that changes a little bit differently from many of the other verbs in English. This might be what we would refer to as a strong verb, in that we're changing all of the verb itself instead of just adding a simple s or es to the ending. Another example that's somewhat different from our pattern is the verb have. Again, in the present form, the singular third person would be the fox has, whereas in the plural form it would be the foxes have. So, some things to consider. The location of the noun does almost always indicate the noun's function, but sometimes sentences can be tricky. So we always have to think about logic as well, and this is something we're going to look at in just a moment. So it's always important to ask, can this noun actually do this action verb? Is that logical? Or can this noun use this state of being verb? Is that logical? And we're going to talk more about state of being verbs in the next set of videos. So let's look at a couple of tricky situations here. First off, can you identify the subject of the verb? Well, look at our first example. The girls in the group, and then we have two choices, either want or wants to go to the movies tonight. Now, again, one of the things we talked about was location. Well, it seems that the location, the noun that's closest or closer to the verb would actually be the word group. And this could be very confusing sometimes when we think of just a simple location idea. However, if we look a little bit closer, we'll notice that the word group is actually part of a prepositional phrase in the group. In this case, the noun group is kind of the object of this prepositional phrase. In this case, it's basically its kind of job is taken at this moment. So in other words, we have to find some other noun that's going to be involved here. Now, we can talk more about what the prepositional phrase is doing. For example, we notice it kind of refers back to the idea of the girls. So that's going to be very key. So in this case, this prepositional phrase is kind of modifying the word girls. Like, which girls are we talking about? Not just any girls, but the girls in a particular group that we're discussing. But notice in this case, the actual subject phrase is going to be the girls. And as we notice, they are plural, which does affect the verb we're going to choose, which in this situation, we're going to choose the word want. So, a couple of things to think about in terms of logic. You see, the girls may not be the only people in this group. So that's something to consider. It's not the whole group, it's only a certain part of the group. And then, of course, thinking about that this part of the group is also plural. So just think for a moment, there could be boys, or even just one boy in this group. So it's not just the whole group that wants it, just the girls. Okay, listen, look at this situation. Now, again, what's the subject of this verb? Well, if we look at just the simple order, this seems like a fairly easy answer, doesn't it? In this case, the novels appears to be the subject of the verb, and we would choose the form were, since it's the plural form that agrees with the word novels. But what could complicate it? Well, one problem is thinking about logic. Even though novels appear to be the subject, we know that novels don't typically write themselves. So in this example, though, we have to think about it in a different way. You see, novels is not what you would refer to as the active subject. You see, novels don't write themselves. So in this case, something else or somebody else has written these novels. So we would refer to the novels as the passive subject. Now, you may remember what active and passive means, but let's kind of just review. Active voice is talking about when somebody actually does an action. So notice in this case, though, that the action form write, the action verb write, is not in a typical active voice form. It's actually what we would refer to as a passive voice construction. Because notice we're using a helping verb here. The helping verb were is actually working together with the participle written. So were written indicates that it's actually not an active voice, but what we refer to as a passive voice. So in this case, the focus of the sentence is the word novels, but it's not the actual person who wrote them. And part of the idea of the passive voice is, in this case, we want to focus more on the novels, not on the person who wrote them. So, for example, you do notice that there's a prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, by Stephen King. Well, by Stephen King is what we would call the passive agent. And it's indicated, of course, here by the preposition by. Now, sometimes we don't even have the passive agent in a sentence, but in this case we do. So even though he wrote the novels, he is not the subject of this particular form of the sentence. So what would happen if we changed the voice of the sentence? So for example, here it's in the passive. What if we changed it to the active voice? Well, then Stephen King would become the subject. Watch what happens. Now you notice, since English tends to pay a lot of attention to the beginning of sentences, now it's easy to notice that Stephen King is now the focus. And this is probably a much more common sentence construction that many people are familiar with. Alright, let's look at our final example. And this time, instead of identifying the subject, couldn't you identify the correct form? So for example, I have the police, and then our choices are have or has, to catch the criminal. So we know police is the subject. It's the only other noun we notice at the beginning of the sentence. So even though the word police appears to be singular, again, notice there's no S on the end of it, it actually is what we consider to be a plural idea. Now there are other words that are also singular kind of in appearance, but actually plural in form. For example, men and women, again, are kind of a strong sort of noun in which you don't add an S, you just change the words. Teeth, for example, is another. And then, of course, people is the plural of person. Though you could say persons, but that's a very special situation. So in this case, the verb we would have to choose is the verb have, because that's the plural form of the verb. So are there other tricky situations? Well, again, these are things that we kind of have to know because these are kind of the ideas in English. So for example, some nouns do end in a final S, but they are singular in nature. So again, words such as the United States or economics, if we're talking about the study of economics. The news, even the word news is singular. Gerunds, which are nouns that ended in ing form, are usually singular in form. And some nouns do represent a group of people, but can be considered singular most of the time. So, for example, the team plays every Saturday. Of course, in our previous example, we talked about the group. Again, many times group can be referred to as one group, so it would be considered a singular most of the time. Some nouns do have the same singular and plural form, though. For example, words like fish, or data, or species. Most of the time, people might treat these as plural, with perhaps the exception of fish if we're talking about one or more. But data generally does refer to a plural idea. It's just that it's become so common to refer to data as singular, sometimes people confuse those ideas. For more information and practice, I would recommend, again, visiting our grammar resources link on our class website to get some more practice when it comes to subject-verb agreement. Now, getting back to the idea of just subjects and verbs in general, as we mentioned, this subject and verb kind of relationship, they need each other. So if you recall in the previous video, we called this a bound relationship. It's bound because they need each other. They're part of grammatical necessity. But let's go a little bit deeper. In fact, we can't express even a complete grammatical idea without at least having one subject and verb in it. So this is what we're going to call a clause. Now, in the previous video, we talked about phrases. So, for example, let's compare phrases to clauses, because both seem to involve groups of words. Well, phrases, for example, are when words interact with each other in some particular way. So in the previous video, we talked about noun phrases and prepositional phrases. And even though they sort of all fit together with some basic grammatical relationship or reason, they aren't complete in the fact that you can't use them by themselves. So, for example, you couldn't just walk around and say, the brown fox. That's not enough information. We recognize that something's missing if we just give phrases all the time. Well, a clause is taking the idea a little bit further. A clause is just not just a group of words, but a group of words that work and revolve around the idea of the subject and verb relationship. And the fact that when we have a subject and verb, this also refers to any of the other words or phrases that relate to the subject and verb if it's necessary. And we're going to talk about that a little more in just a moment. So one thing to think about is oftentimes when we talk about the idea of a sentence, you might be asking, well, what's the difference between a sentence and a clause? Well, a sentence basically is kind of the same as a clause when we have all of the ideas that relate to it. So if you think about it, a sentence needs at least one clause to be considered complete. But one thing you're going to learn in the next video series, sentences could have more than one clause. So the definition of a sentence, at minimum, needs at least one clause. Now, again, we're going back to our original example, and we're going to go ahead and identify the phrases we've already talked about. So we've got that subject phrase, the brown fox, the prepositional phrase, over the lazy dog, and we notice that inside of the prepositional phrase, we also have that noun phrase, or object phrase now that we know that we're going to call it. But there actually is one more phrase that we have not talked about, and that is a verb phrase. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, I don't see a verb phrase here. Well, that's because in this example, we actually have a verb that we would call a phrasal verb. And that phrasal verb is actually the words jumped over. Phrasal verbs are when you have a verb that usually goes together with a preposition. So in this sentence, over is actually part of two different phrases. It's part of the phrasal verb jumped over, and it's also part of the prepositional phrase over the lazy dog. Now, a clause, as we said before, involves at least one subject or verb relationship. However, what if we included only this relationship? Then something would be missing. So watch what happens if we just keep the subject and the verb, which in this case also includes the verb phrase jumped over. Watch what happens. So as we illustrate here, we drop the last part, and now we kind of focus on just those ideas. But it kind of feels incomplete, doesn't it? You see, even though we have a subject and a verb, the grammatical idea doesn't feel finished. And why is that? Well, again, part of the idea is the problem with the verb that we have. Remember, the verb is not just a verb, it was a phrasal verb. So if we go back to the verb profile for a moment, remember, sometimes verbs need an object and sometimes they don't. So part of the idea here is that action verbs, which is one of the three categories of verbs we discussed all the way back in day one, we have to remember that they require a subject. That's something we talked about right kind of from this part one of our video series today. But sometimes they also require something to receive the action from the subject. So someone or something else doing the action to, and again, to is in parentheses here because the word to doesn't always work, someone or something else. So again, a verb that is doing an action, someone or something else, or doing the action to someone or something else, is again what we call a transitive action verb, or we just say transitive verb. A verb that is not doing the action to someone or someone else is called an intransitive verb. Well, how do we know? How do we know if it's transitive or intransitive? Well, part of the idea is, what does the person want to express? What do we actually want to state? So, for example, what if we go back to that idea we started with, and what happens if we simplify it even a little more? So, for example, if we drop the word over and just keep the word jumped. So, for example, if I just said the brown fox jumped, is this idea complete? Well, the answer is yes. It is grammatically complete. It seems very basic, but the question is, why? Why does it feel complete in this case, whereas the previous example didn't? Well, because part of the idea here is, what am I trying to express? Well, the action of this sentence is referring actually back to the subject itself. You see, in this situation, we're just stating that a fox jumped, and that's it. Let's demonstrate it in a visual way. Perhaps this will help a little bit better. So again, the brown fox jumped. So notice in this particular situation, we're kind of defining again the difference between what we call necessary and what is possible. Well, this idea does apply to phrases, and especially clauses as well. You see, in this example, the clause here doesn't actually need anything else to complete the idea. But the question is, are more ideas possible? Well, see, the truth is yes. More ideas are possible. But again, not necessarily needed to complete the grammatical idea of what we have on the screen. You see, this action verb is intransitive. Intransitive, if you remember, means it does not need an object to follow it. It doesn't need another noun to receive its action. Now, let's return to the example we were looking at before, which was adding back the word over. The problem here is that the phrasal verb jumped over needs something to jump over. And one reason of this is because the phrasal verb, again, the jumped over, contains a preposition. And as we stated in our profile, prepositions always need nouns. So again, we stated earlier that these are called phrasal verbs, but now we're just starting to understand that. And the fact that prepositions always need a noun, in this case, tells us that it's definitely not complete. So this refers to the final relationship that we've been kind of hoping to get to, and that is the object of a verb. Objects in general help to answer an important question, and that question is, the subject does or is doing or did the verb to what? So notice, for example, if I said the brown fox jumped over what is what we're looking for, which in this case is the answer, the lazy dog. So in this case, the lazy dog would be the object of the sentence. Now, only action verbs use objects, and as we mentioned before, not every action verb needs an object. Most action verbs in English could be both, but it depends on their use and the intention of the sentence. So like we demonstrated with the fox, let's demonstrate with another example. So for example, here's one using the word breathe. In the intransitive sense, if I said he breathes, the purpose is to indicate that this is just part of being a human. It's his life. It's part of that. It defines him as being a human being. But if I make it a transitive situation, and then I add the word air, now notice the focus of the sentence is different. It's not just talking that he's a human, it talks specifically about what he breathes. So in this case, air is what he breathes. It is the answer to the question, what does he breathe? Or he breathes what? He breathes air. So in this case, air would be the object. So again, getting back to that idea of necessity, in order to satisfy this basic grammatical completeness, it is essential to consider what is necessary in order for it to be complete. Based on this understanding, then it might be better to go back and consider what is the minimum requirement that we're looking for. So consider this now a profile of a clause. We've profiled nouns and verbs and adjectives and so on. Now let's look at it by defining a clause. And again, this will be posted at the bottom of the page here. So again, there's lots of information here. Let's look at it kind of just very briefly. So on the left side, we have what's necessary. And what's necessary is that we need a subject and a verb. That's, again, that's the minimum that we need. And of course, we have to ask ourselves, well, what happens if the verb is an action verb? Well, then two other considerations play a part. Does the verb need an object or not? Is it transitive or intransitive? If the verb is transitive, then we definitely need to add an object. So again, start at the top. We need a subject and verb. But if the verb needs an object, we're going to need a little bit more. If the verb is intransitive, There's not anything else that we need to satisfy the grammatical requirement. Now, of course, again, keep in mind we're talking about the difference between necessity and possibility. There are lots of things that could be possible here that we could add or change in this basic formula. For example, instead of just a simple subject, we could use a subject phrase. Instead of a simple verb, it could be a verb phrase or a phrasal verb too. The object of a verb, again, could be something simple, or it could be an object phrase. Our clause idea could contain adverbs. And of course, the clause could also contain other prepositional phrases. So again, let's be clear. We're trying to define the difference between what is necessary and what is possible. So again, what is necessary is to, again, follow these three ideas. Subject and verb. If the verb needs an object, then this clause is going to need more. It's going to need an object. On the right side, we could add lots of things that are possible, but perhaps aren't necessary to the grammatical idea of the sentence. Now, going back to phrases, again, it's also helpful to think about what's necessary. Because, again, we're going to have phrases and sentences from time to time. So, again, what is necessary? Well, first, at minimum, a phrase, as we said, generally will need one major part of speech, whether it's a noun, a verb, an adjective, or an adverb. But it also needs to follow logic. So, for example, if I have a noun, we can't just include the noun without thinking about, does the noun need an article? Remember, some nouns need articles. It just depends on their use in the example. Again, what about a verb? If we use a verb in a phrase, does the verb need an object? Again, phrasal verbs do. What about adjectives? If we have an adjective involved, remember, adjectives do need nouns. So if I throw an adjective in there, where's the noun that it's describing? Another part of the necessity discussion is also to consider the location of the ideas. So again, order is often very important. So if I have an article, is it before the noun? As we know, articles usually go before nouns. Of course, what if I added an adjective? Well, remember, it's generally article, adjective, and then noun. So again, part of the idea is what's necessary. Now, let's go over to the right side and discuss what's possible. Well, phrases could contain more than two words. We know that is possible. And we know that the major part of speech in the phrase could be involved in more than one relationship. For example, the object of a preposition could also be the object of a phrasal verb. And of course, the object of a preposition may be part of an object phrase. These things are possible. So again, think about, what is the thing we need at minimum to define a phrase? Generally, that one part of speech, one major part of speech. All of the other things must follow if we continue to add ideas to the phrase. Again, all of these profiles that we've discussed today in the video, and we've updated the profiles a lot as we've gone along, but you can find, slides of all of these at the bottom of the page here. Alright, we're going to finish up now looking at adverbs, because adverbs at this point are, again, often very difficult and confusing sometimes. So first off, let's talk about kind of their general purpose, and that is that adverbs add to the verb in some way in the clause. So adverbs do serve an important function because they add information. They help provide context for the action, and even though, again, as we noticed, they're not grammatically essential to a clause, we probably recognize that clauses and sentences would be extremely boring without them. So again, in our profile of adverbs, the major relationship we're going to talk about, the most important really, is that they modify verbs. Now, of course, they do modify other things, adjectives and adverbs, but we're not going to talk about those in this particular video. So again, notice the idea here is they work with verbs. Many times they go after a verb, sometimes they can go before a verb, and sometimes they can even go before the rest of the clause or even the rest of the sentence. And we'll continue to build on these ideas in the next couple of videos. Now again, going back to our original example, which we've analyzed quite a bit here in the last few videos, we've got our subject phrase, the brown fox, a verb jumped, or in this case our phrasal verb is jumped over, and analyzing the prepositional phrase, again, another way to look at it is it's the object phrase of the verb jumped over, and then our adverb quickly. So this particular adverb, though, it probably would be helpful to define what kind of adverb it is. Since we have so many different categories, we probably want to think about, well, what does it actually answer? Well, in this case, it tells us how the action occurred. And it answers this question: how did the brown fox jump? And the answer is quickly. So what happens when we add an adverb to a clause? Well, since there are so many different kinds of adverbs, it's often difficult to tell where their acceptable locations are. Again, we can't just put adverbs everywhere. As we noticed in our profile, they generally go either after the verb or at the beginning of the entire clause itself. Now, this is, of course, not every adverb. But this can complicate things because there are other things in those locations as well. So some questions to consider. Where does the adverb go when we have an object of the verb? And notice adverbs can be more than one thing. So, for example, what happens when there's more than one adverb? Verbs can be described taking place at a certain time, in a certain place, or in a certain way. How do we organize the location of all these ideas? Well, let's go back again to our example. Our example here satisfies our first question, which was, where do adverbs go? Well, again, they usually go after the object. So notice in this case, the word quickly kind of occurred after the object phrase, the lazy dog. Now, let's take another example just for a moment. If I said the man eats quickly, so using the same word, quickly, in this situation, we notice that the verb itself is intransitive. We're not talking about what he's eating, we're only describing the fact that he eats. So, in this case, our use of the verb is intransitive. Now, again, part of the question first is, well, could we add an object? Would that be possible here? Well, if I wanted to change the intention of the sentence, we could. So, for example, I add the object phrase, a sandwich. It is possible. Of course, now I'm redefining the sentence or changing it. So in this case, what we're talking about now is what he's eating. And remember, since we're adding the word sandwich to this sentence, we do also need an article, because in this case, an article is necessary, because this is a singular countable noun. But notice what happens. The order here is going to play an important part. We can't move the adverb to be closer to the verb. Again, watch. The man eats quickly a sandwich. Now, in some languages, this might be possible, but it's not possible in English. So, again, this helps us understand something. This helps us understand how certain ideas move in a clause. Just like we notice that verbs usually come after the subject idea, well, in this case, we notice that objects generally come after verbs. So we can go back now and redefine our verb and adverb profiles a little bit. So as we notice, again, we've got intransitive verbs, and intransitive verbs usually have an adverb that follows because they don't need an object. But what happens to transitive verbs? Well, they need an object. So in this case, it'll become transitive verb plus the object, then an adverb if it's possible. And it's the same thing when we look at the verb profile. Again, verbs can be modified by adverbs. And adverbs, as we see, again, generally follow intransitive verbs immediately. But in this case, with the transitive verb, the object is going to separate them. Now let's go on to the second question. What if we want to add more adverbs? So, for example, we have the word quickly. What if we want to add an adverb of time and an adverb of place? Where would they go? Well, notice in my next example what happens to the order. In this case, the adverb of place I've highlighted in purple, and the one in time I've highlighted in brown. So if you notice, now that we've added more information, we do have to think again about their location. The brown fox jumped over the lazy dog quickly here yesterday. So in this case, if these ideas are present in the same clause, then the usual order follows like this. Adverb of manner goes first, adverb of place comes next, and an adverb of time goes last. Now, for example, what if we didn't have the word here? Well, then the adverb of time would just move up. You would just say, the brown fox jumped over the lazy dog quickly yesterday. So part of the idea is if one of the ideas is missing, then the other idea would move up if we need to. So again, to continue to add information, if you'll notice over in our rule and limitation, if we have more adverbs to the clause, then we do have a particular order to think about. Manner usually goes first, place comes next, times go afterwards. Now, let's go back for a moment and talk a little bit more about adverbs of place and time. You probably know many general adverbs of place already, words such as here, there, and over there. But you probably recognize that prepositional phrases, and this is something that's going to be kind of an interesting discovery for us today, is that prepositional phrases can also indicate place. For example, to the store, or in the building, or at the bank, indicate some sort of place or direction. In the time section, again, we've talked about general ideas such as now, or later, or then, or next. We could even use calendar times, such as yesterday, today, tomorrow. But we can also use prepositional phrases, such as in the morning, or at 2 p.m. And it's these last two that we want to look at a little more carefully here, because now we start to understand something. We've talked a lot about prepositional phrases, but we haven't actually talked a lot about their purpose. So we've talked about how to form a preposition, what a form of the preposition is, and kind of the form of a prepositional phrase, but what about their function? Well, again, they create prepositional phrases, but what do they actually do for us? Well, again, as we noticed on our profile, we said prepositions indicate location, time, purpose, and reason. Well, that should look very familiar because that's also very similar to what adverbs answer. They answer where, when, how are these things done, and even why. So in this case, what we need to recognize is that prepositional phrases do have a function. Well, they can often serve the same function as an adverb. That is, they can indicate the time, place, and even the manner of the verb in the clause. Not all prepositional phrases do this, but several do serve this role. So now we can redefine prepositions a little bit better. They work with nouns to create prepositional phrases, and then the prepositional phrases themselves can often function like adverbs to modify verbs. So, what have we learned so far? Well, one thing we've learned is that nouns are important. In fact, they're the key pieces. Their relationships are essential to most of the other ideas that we have in English. And nouns serve three important relationships. They can be the subject, they can be the object of a verb, and they can be the object of a preposition. When we talked about major versus minor parts of speech, minor parts of speech help provide the structure to the sentence and connect those major parts of speech, which again we referred to in the first video as also calling them content words. Minor parts of speech are often very limited in their function. So again, articles, for example, really only do one thing. But some of them, and this is kind of our new discovery, some of them want to act like major parts of speech. So for example, prepositional phrases that function as adverbs. Clauses, as we've learned today, kind of serve as what we might call the basic grammatical unit of completeness, in that they require a subject and verb relationship at minimum. So again, this is kind of where we're going to begin here when we talk about the unit. This is where we kind of begin. So in order for a clause to be grammatically complete, it depends on the subject and verb agreeing in that form, singular or plural, and that the relationship be logical and in the correct locations, the correct order. And then we have to remember that in a clause, the verb might need an object. So if it does need an object, that's called a transitive verb. If it doesn't need an object, it's intransitive. Of course, we've also said today that grammar is about what is possible, meaning that you could add more parts of speech to a clause to make things more interesting. This also means that phrases could be substituted for individual parts of speech, and they're functioning in the same way. So again, for example, if I use a simple noun, I could use a noun phrase perhaps also. Or with prepositional phrases, remember, prepositional phrases can often function like adverbs, depending on what their functions are and where they are in the sentence. Again, let's go back to the ideas we discussed earlier about grammar in general. Do these words make sense together? Where do they go in relation to each other? Does every word here have at least one relationship? And is it possible to add more? What happens when we do? If we again think about these four categories, these will continue to help strengthen and improve our understanding of grammar. Because as we noticed, again, we can know a lot about some of the individual parts of speech. But as we mentioned right at the beginning of part 1 of our video today, the idea is knowing the strategy sometimes is different from just knowing a few relationships. For example, we might be aware in general of that subject and verb and adverb relationship, or we might kind of generally know, okay, well, prepositions need objects. But how do they all fit together? What happens when we continue to expand the idea? Do we know what all of the purposes are for all of the parts of speech and how they fit together? Is knowing just a few pieces and what they do, is that the same thing as knowing the complete strategy of grammar? Again, if we start looking at all of the ideas, can we keep all of the ideas straight in our head? Because what happens when we start adding more information? Do we know exactly where they fit together? Well, this will always be a challenge for us. And again, as we mentioned before, you may not be a language master. Certainly, as we mentioned with chess, it takes a long time to kind of understand how all of these ideas fit together. But if we continue to study and understand and reincorporate new information, hopefully we'll be able to see the strategy of language a whole lot better. See you next time for part 4, Understanding the Tune. Thanks for watching.